Welcome to the Landscape Management Network's video series. In this video, we're going to talk about every landscaper's biggest obstacle to increased profit. It's not your sales, your customers, or your competition. It's waste and the incredible drain it has on your sales and profits when it's not managed and controlled. With every new landscape season, Dan looked forward for ways to get ahead in his business. Each winter, he was optimistic about the year ahead and how this year it was going to be easier and more profitable than the last. But every year, things seemed to end up the same. He'd start the year off with a hope for better profits. Then he'd spend the year working his tail off to try to make it happen. And year after year, the plan just wasn't working. Here Dan was, 10 years later, still needing to work just that bit harder to achieve what he felt would be real success. It was wearing Dan out. It wasn't that he hadn't worked harder. In fact, Dan didn't think anyone worked harder for less money. He'd added crews, trucks, and new types of work. His sales grew and grew, but his profits were stagnant. In fact, Dan made more money when it was just Dan that ran a single crew instead of the 3 or 4 crews he currently ran. Through his budget, Dan realized his success and lack of success all really boiled down to his crew's productivity. Nothing was more important than managing and being efficient at his labor. But every time Dan added to his company, he could manage each crew less and less. He bounced from job site to try to stay on top of everything, but every time he grew, his problems just got bigger. Without Dan, his drive, and his experience to manage their work, his crews got less and less productive. Without Dan in the field, mistakes, rework, waiting, miscommunication, and equipment breakdowns, they all increased. His costs started rising quickly, and his sales were rising, but a little more slowly. All of these wastes had real costs that had to be absorbed by Dan's business. His profit was robbed to pay the extra costs of wages, equipment, and materials that resulted from these mistakes and waste. But after really looking at his numbers, it didn't take long for Dan to realize that the real waste was in the lost opportunity for billable hours. Not only was Dan paying for the wasted time, but they were losing valuable billable hours, even days. Every mistake was costing him the direct cost of the labor, equipment, and materials, and the lost opportunity of potential sales. And that got Dan's mind really thinking. When they were redoing warranty work, they were spending money on labor, equipment, and materials, and they weren't adding to his sales. Every hour they spent redoing work was not just costing him $20 an hour in labor, it was also costing Dan at least another $60 an hour in lost sales or billable labor, plus the lost revenue for billable equipment and materials. A gas station stop to fill a $5 jerry can was costing him at least $60. $15 in costs for the 15 minutes worth of wages for the 3 guys in the truck, and at least $45 in lost sales opportunity. The time spent loading and unloading uncovered trailers each night wasn't just the cost of the time. Every day they were losing valuable opportunity to increase their billable hours and revenue. Dan started adding up all the wastes that were robbing him and his people of potential success. These wastes included things like poor planning, poor communication, lack of goals or expectations given to the crew, insufficient information to and from the field, mistakes on site layouts and measurements, and people standing around or making busy waiting for clear instructions or decisions. There was also extra trips to the vendor, incorrect material orders, too much material delivered to sites, which then had to be reloaded back on the truck, taken back to the yard, and unloaded again back at the yard. Washroom trips, when a portable washroom could have been dropped on site. Talking and texting on his cell phones. Don't get Dan started on that one. And breaks and lunches that went on 10 minutes too long, day after day. He also looked at his disorganized trucks and tools and wondered how much time his people spent looking for stuff, or forgetting tools, equipment, fuel, and materials. No wonder it happened so often. And then there were the equipment breakdowns due to neglect, and of course overall poor planning, because Dan was so busy putting out the fires that all these other wastes cost. Poor systems and planning were killing Dan's profits. How many times had his crews gone to site, only then to figure out what requirements they were missing? Every one of these problems not only cost Dan money, but each one robbed Dan of valuable sales opportunity. And also, it was robbing Dan's people of potential wages. Dan needed to replace the information and experience that was stuck in his head with systems that his people could follow. He could answer the questions that so often cause these problems to occur. What tasks needed to get done? When they needed to happen? Who was responsible? How it gets done? The methods that Dan follows? And why everyone will benefit when things get done right. He went about his company then, relentlessly searching out waste and eliminating its causes, using things like 5 Whys and 5 S's to help him along the way. And to make it all make sense to his field personnel, Dan trained them not only on the new systems, but also what it was actually costing the company and ultimately their wages when they worked unproductively. He used his company budget's labor ratio to not only set productivity goals, but also to set his foreman's wages. The more work or production they could complete in a year, the bigger their potential for wage. And without sharing too much company information, Dan and his crews quickly began to realize that their success was directly tied to the company's success. And when everyone was speaking the same language of productivity, waste elimination, and the opportunities that could be won or lost, everything started to run a whole lot smoother. Dan's sales grew by replacing time spent on waste or non-billable hours with time spent on billable work. His profit grew because his costs stayed the same, while his billable revenue increased drastically by reducing non-billable hours and replacing them with billable hours. Dan's people began to think and make decisions more like Dan did. First, they could follow Dan's systems, but secondly, now they saw how they could benefit by making sure these systems were carried out and that things happened productively. And with less problems, everyone began to find work less stressful, more enjoyable, and more financially rewarding. Thanks for watching. We're the Landscape Management Network, and we help great landscape contractors build great landscape businesses. We've got budgeting and estimating tools to make sure you're priced for profit, and systems to make sure you're organized for profit. And finally, there's an online training section to give your employees every opportunity for success. It's everything you ever wanted in your landscape business, but you didn't know existed. For more information, check us out at www.landscapemanagementnetwork.com.